and I am really pleased to welcome you all to the first in our joint series with UK STT. This is our Green Alliance webinar programme. This was following on from the success of last year through lockdown. And hopefully we're hoping that we're going to get some sort of planned face-to-face events in the coming months. But certainly for the time being, we've got this webinar programme, and I'm delighted to welcome Charlotte Farmer from Hydrogen East, who's going to be first up today to talk about hydrogen and project concept design. So can I just ask, as I say, with a bit of housekeeping, what we'll plan to do is we'll go through Charlotte's presentation first, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. So therefore, please use the questions and answers sort of chat function, and we'll pick those up at the end of Charlotte's presentation. So without further ado, as I say, if we can just make sure that you're all muted, I think you all are, I would like to hand over to Charlotte.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks for having me here today. I'll just start sharing my presentation. And give me a thumbs up when that looks all right. Super, thank you. So I thought I would cover today a few broad topics on hydrogen concept designs, because there's obviously a lot of different material out there available on all of the different feasibility studies that are going on a technical basis, on a commercial basis, and I thought I'd try and tie them together and look at all the different subsectors where we think hydrogen could be prominent in the future. I'll start off with just a high-level overview of Hydrogen East and what we're about. And before I click through to the next slide, I'd just draw your attention to that diagram. So these are some of the different things that we're considering in our role in the east of England, looking at opportunities across the board, whether that's transport, power, production, or even heat in the longer term. So Hydrogen East was formed in summer 2020 with the overarching ambition to is my slide still sharing? Sorry, Teams is having a moment on me.
Yes, we're still sharing.
Thank you. So that we can research, analyse and promote the different pathways to bringing hydrogen to the east of England, because we felt that a lot of the debate around hydrogen was focusing up north in the industrial clusters, and actually the opportunity is different for the east of England, but is just as valid. So we've come from a background in electricity and gas, so we're applying all of our communal knowledge on energy markets and working out how hydrogen will integrate alongside those two. Our ethos is that hydrogen will look very different on a place-based basis. In essence, saying we can't take a cookie-cutter approach and say, well, it works in the northwest, it'll work in the east of England. It has to have a different character, a different flavour. And in order to determine what that looks like for the east of England, we are taking a bottom-up approach, looking across the whole energy system, working out where the touch points are between gas, electricity, water, and wider planning for the local communities as well. I've popped my email address up there, so if anyone wants to have a chat after this webinar, I'd be delighted to talk to you. So just to recap, I'm sure many of you have listened to hydrogen webinars over the last few months. There seems to be one every day, but just for those who aren't as familiar, I'll do a recap of the main hydrogen topics. So we broadly think about the categories in three ways: the production, the distribution and storage, and then the end use. Production is broadly categorised in our colour system. We've got grey hydrogen, which is the most common production method at the moment, reforming natural gas into hydrogen and allowing the CO2 to be released into the atmosphere. Blue hydrogen would be the same process, but ensuring that the carbon is captured and stored. And then green hydrogen, which is the production of hydrogen through electrolysis. The government is moving to create a low carbon hydrogen standard. and moving perhaps away from this colour coding system. So as long as it met a carbon threshold in production, it would classify as low carbon, and we're awaiting confirmation from government on that in the coming weeks and months. On the distribution side, is perhaps the least understood area or the least developed area in current policy. And I've broken down what I think are probably the 5 main categories. The pipelines, obviously your area of interest. We've got lots of work going on behind the scenes around testing the material viability, all of the different component parts that go into the national infrastructure. We can probably expect some repurposing of pipelines, but there will also be occasions to have dedicated new pipelines installed as well. We've got tube trailers, the specialised vehicles that move hydrogen around, very expensive to do, and something that there's not enough in the market at the moment, so very overutilised. Pressurised containers, very much similar to what you have for pressurised gas canisters at the moment. And then static tank storage, having something on site allows you a bit of a buffer. And then the 5th one, which is not perhaps spoken about as much, but is the chemical storage of hydrogen. So whether that is perhaps converting it to ammonia to allow it to be stored at a greater density, or in other vectors, something that is going to get greater attention in the coming years. And on the use side, I break it down into 4 categories. We have industrial processes, particularly high-grade heat, heat more generally for commercial and domestic properties, transport, and for us, we're particularly focusing on the opportunity in either long-range transport or heavy-duty vehicles, where we see probably over the 10-ton mark that hydrogen becomes the more logical solution compared to electrification. And then finally, a small point on power. Hydrogen is very flexible. We could use it in backup generators where currently diesel operates. We could use it in flexible generation, perhaps those gas peaking plants that helps balance the electricity networks, and equally use it as an alternative energy storage vector compared to relying on lithium-ion battery storage. So there's the overview. What's already happening in terms of projects? So the debate is really intensely focused around the industrial clusters. The map on the right-hand side there gives you the solid rings where there's real activity progressing, and particularly I would flag the Northwest and their HyNet, and also up in St Fergus, the Acorn project and all the work going on in Aberdeen. We've seen a number of feasibility studies and demonstrator projects being active, and hopefully in 2022 and the next few years, we'll actually see these demonstrators scaling to active use. So I've just flagged around Bacton a little dotted line because we see that as a potential significant hydrogen hub for the east of England, but there are other locations as well. So if anyone's got an east of England focus, perhaps we could chat through that another time. But one of the points of difference for us is that while we see a lot of blue hydrogen discussions going on around the country, we think there's probably a dual development pathway where we see some blue hydrogen potentially around the gas terminal at Bacton, but also given our high penetration of offshore wind and solar in the east of England, there could be a good case for distributed green hydrogen production. And whether that means producing and using at the same location, it might be the case, but it might also mean we need to come up with some solutions for distributing that green hydrogen. So whether that's by vehicle, canister or pipeline will depend on the different projects that we look into. So to the main topic of today, I'm looking at the different concept designs of how hydrogen fits in a project. And I thought I'd start with production, and specifically how hydrogen production compare with offshore wind, because that's something that we look at a lot for the east of England, but is probably going to be a common problem for a number of other coastal areas. So we have a large offshore wind fleet in the east of England, and the UK as a whole has a growing offshore wind fleet. I don't know if anyone remembers that quote from Boris Johnson about becoming the Saudi Arabia of wind. So there is a trajectory there that the wind fleet will increase. But coming with that are some imbalances. So, for example, you can have a lot of offshore wind production that can't ever get to market, either because the wind is blowing in the middle of the night and the power demand is lower, so it would just be going to waste or into storage if it can. And equally, there are a number of constraints on the electricity system, and that's particularly a problem for our area. We've got a lot of offshore wind connecting into a relatively under-reinforced grid, so a number of the wind farms are paid to turn down, be constrained of. So there's a good case to say there's a lot of underutilized wind power going out, and how we can maximize that wind potential is by pairing it with energy storage. For some projects that will be battery storage, but there's also a good case for saying perhaps we think about tying in hydrogen production, and they can be mutually beneficial. And even from that, you can then start to break into really diverse cross-spectral energy things. I think the OGA put out a report not long ago that had the phrase energy island in it. So perhaps having battery storage, hydrogen production, offshore wind, all collaborating and hosting a kind of energy ecosystem offshore. But in terms of concept design for how to pair with offshore wind, I've stolen two beautiful diagrams from the Solving the Integration Challenge report from the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult last year, 2 years ago now. So I would recommend having a read of this if this is something that aligns with your interest. There's a lot of information on the different concept designs and the relative costs of different options. But just to pick out the two main differences, one, it would be you have your offshore wind farm and the power is flowed back to shore, and then the hydrogen production and distribution happens onshore. And that's an interesting one in terms of the business case. You know, perhaps you could have your electrolyzer behind the main substation for the wind farm, and you're effectively then able to use your energy that would be otherwise constrained or prevented from flowing onto the grid. We've got some examples emerging of that, and I think the Gigastack project that's happening between Ørsted, ITM and the Phillips refinery is an example of this, where Hornsea will be flowing power to shore and then the production happening there in order to provide a pipeline directly into the refinery for use in their own processes. However, there is an alternative, and the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult believe that on a like-for-like basis, it's likely to be slightly cheaper based on a levelised production of hydrogen cost. And you can see here that they're actually establishing hydrogen production offshore, perhaps on old oil rigs or on dedicated new platforms. And I think there are even some projects that are looking at integrating hydrogen production into the turbine base or the foundations themselves. So this would, instead of seeing the power flowing to shore, you're having the production on the platform and then piping the hydrogen to shore. There are a number of locations where this could work. I think it again is done on a case-by-case basis, but if you've got an existing gas infrastructure, there's opportunity to reuse old oil and gas pipelines. But also, if there's near enough to shore, there could be interest in having dedicated new pipelines as well. I've brought out some examples, but in the interest of time, I'll just leave them there for you to look at in your own time. It's interesting that the majority of the examples I could find were looking at this option where they were producing hydrogen offshore and piping it back to shore. So moving from production to use, I've brought out the first example of applying hydrogen in a heat project, and this is for an industrial process. So one of the main themes that you see in the debate around energy use for manufacturers or energy intensive industries is the fact that they are struggling to find alternative options that are electrification doesn't produce the same intensity of heat or reliability that they're after, perhaps. And they're very concerned about carbon leakage, which is the idea that just because a production is cheaper abroad, the carbon involved in those products being made abroad and then imported back is not adequately captured. And I think if you attend some of the parliamentary group sessions, that comes through quite strongly, this concern that carbon isn't properly priced into industrial processes in other countries. So bearing that in mind, there's quite a constrained budget for these companies, and they're looking for viable alternatives to their existing gas or solid fuel. And one of the interesting examples that come out is the Pilkington glass factory up in St Helens. And this was a demonstration project that lasted for a few weeks based on the HyNet demonstrators. And what they were doing is basically proving that they could run the sheet glass production on hydrogen instead of natural gas. And while the demonstrator was quite self-contained and used bottle gas, there is a strong case for the HyNet consortium in building dedicated hydrogen pipelines, and in future that could be one such example that connects into a dedicated pipeline. In terms of heat for domestic and smaller commercial use, obviously there's a vast amount going on between the various gas distribution networks and National Grid itself, looking at anything from leakage rates to how it impacts the material integrity of pipelines. And I'm sure you're all aware on some of the more technical aspects than I am, but there is a lot of work going on to prove that a conversion, whether partial, allowing hydrogen blends, or complete conversion to hydrogen, is feasible in the next few years. I think we're hoping to see a little more certainty around this topic, potentially by 2025, 2026. I think some of the provisional results from these studies are really optimistic, and they illustrate a strong potential to have that blending or that conversion at reasonable cost and time. However, irrespective of these technical and safety considerations, there's a lot going on outside of this that will determine the extent to which hydrogen is used for heat. So trying to plan now for how hydrogen integrates into heating projects is very difficult without a clear sign from government. Obviously, there's some indications coming through on requiring gas boilers after a certain date to be hydrogen ready, and they certainly haven't ruled it out, but it makes it hard for project developers to commit to this without that certainty. However, there's one aspect that I think is underrepresented, and a number of other projects ought to be including this as an option in their design, is the use of hydrogen heating for district heating schemes or community heating schemes. They can be quite cost efficient and energy efficient processes. You basically have a centralised boiler house that's heating water, and whether that's likely to be natural gas at the moment, but could be green hydrogen in the longer term, producing the hot water, and then it's flowed to the various properties in the district or community setting. We think that's got interesting potential, particularly for us in the east of England, because there's considerable population growth anticipated, and even more so in southern England as well. So it could be the case that new housing developments, planners should be having that conversation of, do we make these new housing developments dependent on the gas grid, or do we try and look at something more innovative and have a district heating scheme that then can be swapped out for hydrogen at the right time. And it's also interesting for us because we have quite a high oil dependency in the east of England, despite having some of the big gas pipelines flowing out of Bacton to the rest of the UK. There's a significant number of communities are still reliant on oil heating. So if there was a cluster of a village, perhaps the electricity network is not particularly strong in that location, it would be too far to connect into the gas grid. Perhaps having the self-contained hydrogen district heating system could be an option. Moving to transport, I won't dwell on this too much, but I've picked out an example of JCB, and it's indicative that the heavy-duty transport market are very interested in the hydrogen opportunities. So obviously the parent company for JCB own Wrightbus as well. They've got developments in buses, tractors, excavators, anything to do with construction and maintenance fleets. And we're seeing that across the board. A number of manufacturers are looking at creating hydrogen prototypes or are in the process of making them commercialised. We see really strong potential in the back to base heavy duty vehicles, so perhaps like buses or municipal vehicles that are regularly on a route returning to the same point to refuel every night, and that's something that you can start to create these hydrogen projects without then necessarily being the full refueling infrastructure like you have for petrol and diesel. We see, starting with buses and municipal vehicles, moving into a wider kind of construction, agriculture, some of the non-road mobile machinery, and then in the longer term, shipping and aviation too. So in terms of how we've been working on developing transport concepts, I've picked out an example here of Lowestoft. And we started from the basis that in order to make a hydrogen refueling point viable, it needed to be accessible and used by multi-transport users. So this diagram here brings out a rough mapping that we've done of where the different transport users are. We've got the port of Lowestoft down here, non-road mobile machinery, crew transfer vessels for the offshore wind fleet, and then in the longer term, some larger construction vessels as well. We've got points where the municipal fleet is based. We've got connections into a railway line that's flagged as potential for hydrogen conversion, and we've also got a bus depot up in the northern section there. So what we did was we looked at uptake rates of these different vehicles, ones that were available to buy now, ones that would probably not be coming to market for 5 or 10 years, and starting to develop a picture of what sort of infrastructure that would merit based on those uptake rates. And once we'd come up with some viable locations based on those considerations and land ownership and infrastructure, we could start to create a high-level business case. One thing that might be of interest in terms of physical infrastructure, and I haven't unfortunately got the maps to indicate it, is that we were looking at the interactions between the gas networks, electricity networks, and water availability. So we could layer over those different elements, and it could help us to rule out or rule in certain development locations on that basis. I hope you can see my mouse pointer, but just where I'm above the bus symbol, there was actually a former gas holder that was in the process of being decommissioned, and we knew that gas pipelines run along this axis here, and we had substations at relevant points near the port and also other locations as well. So having that information to hand enabled us to piece together different elements and say, well, we could get a substantial connection in at this substation, but this one has no capacity for new demand. We've got renewable energy connecting in here that we could use to improve the business case. And in the longer term, if we wanted to be injecting into the gas system, we should probably be based here. So all of these multi-layers of considerations go in into determining the best locations. I haven't spoken too much on the water consideration, but as we were by the coast, we were also considering some potential there for desalination in future, because we're in a very water stressed area. And if we were to be looking at taking water through the existing network, it could be a conflict based on other draws on the water demand in the area. So there was potential for desalination in this scheme design as well. Again, if anyone's interested in looking at this in more detail, I'd be happy to have a one-to-one conversation. Just to reiterate here that we were looking primarily at that back to base refueling thing, and in the longer term, we would love to develop a strategic skeleton of where refueling infrastructure would need to be to help those transport users that are using corridors. So perhaps we'll need to refuel at multiple points, but are using reliable routes, or indeed just visiting traffic. And we get a lot of cross-county movements in the east of England with haulage going to and from the ports. Just finishing up here on use of hydrogen in power. And it's something that is perhaps under-considered at the moment. One thing that I am looking at the moment is looking at how we could potentially convert or replace flexible gas generators, or even diesel powered ones, with blended hydrogen or ammonia. We're looking at a couple of system designs where we are saying this location has a significant diesel usage currently. If we were to anticipate a 25% hydrogen or ammonia blend into that, we could have a production facility of X megawatts in size. Perhaps then we could offer a pipeline across to other commercial users that might require it for industrial heat purposes. So trying to tie together production and use in power generation, I think, is going to be an important one, particularly because as we transition to a more intermittent renewables in our energy mix, having that ability to act flexibly and help to balance energy requirements will be a key one. And if you're familiar with the National Grid future energy scenarios, the role for hydrogen in flexible generation comes up quite clearly in that. I've picked out some examples from companies that we know are already active in this, but outside of the larger energy producers, so more off-grid solutions perhaps. We've got options in backup generation, which can be useful for hotels in London perhaps. We've got remote construction equipment. So for example, if you need to work on a construction site to have limits on the noise levels that you can have, or emissions levels, having a generator equivalent from hydrogen is useful. And equally, I've mentioned a couple of times about the difficulties of electrifying certain aspects given the state of the electricity grid in certain locations. So if there was a location where we couldn't viably put in a rapid EV charger, is there a way of having a hydrogen fuel cell that uses stored hydrogen nearby to produce that rapid charge option? So I flagged the example of AFC Energy and their Extreme E partnership there. So just to close up, what is the opportunity in 2022? I think the glib answer is that there's a lot of opportunity, and it will very much depend on the sectors and the locations that you're looking at. personally, we're keeping a close eye on the publications due from government on hydrogen business model support, and the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund, as well as the Industrial Hydrogen Accelerator that's due to be launched as well. So all three of these not only provide funding to get projects moving, but also give that confidence for investors. So we're expecting a flurry of activity once there's more certainty coming out around those. Obviously, we haven't got time to unpack all of the different energy security issues that are flowing around as a result of the Russia-Ukraine issues. But will that energy security review that we're anticipating cause renewable generation and hydrogen to come up the agenda? We'd certainly like it to. And then my final point is on greater certainty around the potential for blending hydrogen into the distribution networks, or even the NTS, could be game changing. So effectively, not only helps you distribute the hydrogen, but has that sort of innate storage capacity as well. So certainly something we can't wait to hear the ruling on. I think that's all of my slides, so I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you for that, Charlotte. That was excellent. I noticed that there aren't any typed questions, but I can see Ewan's got his hand up, so over to you.
Hi, Charlotte. Thank you for your presentation. That was really fascinating. I was wanting to, you mentioned in one of your case studies looking at the water supply for green hydrogen production. So I'm from Scottish Water, so I'm coming from a water company here. I think, and you talked about, okay, we're water stressed, so we're probably going to go to electrolysis to use not electrolysis, to desalination. One thing I'd like to understand perhaps is, to my mind, there's an electricity premium if you use desalination, it being a very power intensive process. Is there anything available online that could help me understand what the sort of comparative advantage in their energy step using fresh water is? Is there any sort of guides that you're aware of that I'd like to work out, if I've got so much water, how much power do I need to produce so much hydrogen, you know, and just as a high level concept?
I think I've got a couple of examples, but off the top of my head, I can't remember the exact exchange equivalents. Perhaps if I take your note of your email address, I could fire them over after this.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But well, we can do this after the. But just to expand on the desalination point, one of the two main reasons that are driving us to look at that is partly because Norfolk and Suffolk are very water stressed. They're looking at solutions of bringing in a number of measures to support the high usage for agriculture. It's quite a concern among local stakeholders. But having said that, because it's got a large amount of coast and a number of big energy assets on the coast, the case for desalination in our area is much stronger than it might be in a landlocked location. For example, we've got the EDF nuclear power plant at Sizewell. They're planning to expand that, and they're looking at a number of different options to use their excess heat or overnight generation in a more innovative way. So perhaps that could be a location that has significant electrolysis, but also alongside desalination.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've had another question in from Nick Preston. So thank you very much, Charlotte, for a most interesting insight into the challenges of hydrogen. We heard recently how hydrogen-powered site cabins are now available. What are the other geographical areas of the UK doing akin to your not-for-profit Hydrogen East?
Oh, that's a good question. There's a number of very similar organisations, and I'm not 100% familiar with how they structure themselves. I know that Hydrogen Sussex are active. I believe their local enterprise partnership supports them. There's an initiative being launched, and I believe it's a consortium that Cadent have developed along East Coast, ranging all the way from Newcastle down to Lincolnshire. And then there's Hydrogen Northwest, and I believe they're a consortium as well. So there's lots of different similar activities going on, but quite how they're structured are a little bit different.
Okay, thank you for that, Charlotte. And is there any other questions that we have? I'll open that out to a bit of a, if you want to pop your hands up rather than typing. No? Okay. So I've got a question. I haven't got my hand up, but so what are the sort of challenges you faced with, obviously there's been a hell of a lot of research going on here and various sort of stakeholders. Have you sort of met any challenges with sort of stakeholder management?
The challenge is not necessarily in interesting people in the topic, because you talk to them about the various benefits and opportunities, and they see it quite readily. It's moving from that interest to the intent that we're finding difficult. A lot of people, particularly local authorities, very stretched for budgets, and I think until there is a little bit more certainty on the funding regimes and the business support mechanism for hydrogen, a lot of people are going to be waiting and seeing before they commit to projects. So that has been the biggest challenge. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Any more? I don't think we've got any, no one else has got their hands up. Haven't got any more in the chat box. So as Charlotte had sort of quite rightly pointed out, I know you mentioned a good question as well, so we'll make sure that your details are all shared as well, so that you can get those sort of questions answered. But I'd just like to thank you, Charlotte, for an excellent insight into Hydrogen East. Really, really informative. So thank you very much for your time. And thank you all for joining us on this first Green Alliance webinar programme with UKSTT and Pipeline Industries Guild. Just like to, I'm sharing my screen here. So for the next event that's taking place on the 21st of April is another webinar. So again, this is an update from the robotics, roadwork and excavation systems. So what we will do is we'll make sure that everybody that's attended today will automatically get a link through into the next event. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to say to thank everybody again, and great sort of kicking off the Green Alliance webinar programme for 2022. So thank you very much everybody for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.